I still remember the sound of her heels echoing across the marble floor. Sharp, deliberate, and dripping with entitlement. The kind of sound that didn't need to ask for attention because it already demanded it. She was the CEO's daughter, the new vice president of strategic growth, though everyone in the building knew her promotion was more about bloodline than brilliance. And that morning, she walked straight into my office with a smile that felt like a warning. "I'm making a few leadership changes," she said, her tone sweet as poison. "Effective immediately, you're relieved of your duties. No warning, no reason. Just those words, dropped like a grenade in the middle of my calm. It took me a few seconds to register what had happened. I had been leading the M&A team for nearly 4 years, overseeing some of the most complex acquisitions the company had ever attempted. The biggest one, the one worth $285 million, was just days from completion. I'd been working 14-hour days, sleeping in my office, skipping weekends, all for that moment. And she fired me 72 hours before my $127,000 performance bonus was due. Her smile didn't waver as she handed me the termination letter. "We'll make sure HR processes your exit smoothly," she said, tilting her head. "You've been valuable. Like a tool she'd just used and decided to throw away." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just nodded, slid the paper off her manicured fingers and looked her dead in the eye. "Of course," I said quietly. "I'm sure you'll handle things beautifully." She left, satisfied, certain she'd humiliated me. What she didn't realize was that I'd already built a silent insurance policy months ago, a network of files, notes, and digital breadcrumbs that told a story her father's board would never want to read. You see, when you spend years watching corporate predators devour their prey, you start to learn how they move. You start to see the patterns, the shell companies, the fake valuations, the missing numbers that vanish like smoke. And when you're the one who built the numbers in the first place, you know exactly where to pull the thread. As the door closed behind her, I sat in silence for a long time, letting the humiliation burn its way through my chest until it hardened into something colder. Not anger, not grief, something sharper. Because that $127,000 they stole from me wasn't just money, it was the price they put on my silence. And silence was never part of my plan. They thought they'd erased me before the finish line. What they didn't know was that I'd already rewritten the ending, and in 4 days, the empire her father built, the one she tried to inherit through arrogance and cruelty, would begin to collapse from the inside. That afternoon, I walked out of the building carrying a small cardboard box filled with fragments of a life I'd built from scratch. Photos, old reports, a cracked mug with my initials. I didn't look back. The air outside felt too still, too quiet, like the calm before a storm no one else could sense. The company, Rutherford and Vale Capital Partners, wasn't just my workplace. It was my battleground, my creation, my curse. I joined when it was barely surviving after a bad acquisition. Back then, the CEO, Richard Vale, had been the kind of man who demanded results at any cost. Ruthless, brilliant, unpredictable. And for years, I'd delivered those results. But when his daughter, Lena Vale, returned from her so-called executive training in London, everything changed. She wasn't there to learn. She was there to rule. And her father, blinded by guilt and pride, handed her authority she hadn't earned. At first, I tried to guide her, gently, diplomatically. I drafted reports for her to present, explained the merger process, walked her through risk models. She smiled, took credit, and dismissed my input in meetings. Then she started replacing my analysts with her friends, cutting corners, approving valuations that didn't add up. I stayed quiet because the deal mattered more than my ego. The merger with Halberg Dynamics worth $285 million was my legacy project. I'd spent a year building trust, auditing books, negotiating terms. It was airtight, until she began tampering with it. I remember one night, long before she fired me, when I found an internal memo she'd drafted to inflate Halberg's projected revenue by nearly 20%. "We need to make the numbers look exciting," she'd written. Exciting. In finance, that word means dangerous. That was the night I started keeping records, emails, financial trails, hidden backups stored off-site, not because I planned revenge, but because I knew what people like her were capable of. So when the axe finally fell, I wasn't shocked. The timing told me everything. My bonus was due on Monday. The merger was scheduled to finalize that Friday. By firing me on Tuesday, she not only avoided paying me, but also took sole credit for the deal's success. Smart move, if she'd been smarter. Because she didn't know I still had access to certain encrypted files. The kind the firm's system didn't even register anymore. Files that proved she'd doctored projections and signed off on false disclosures. I didn't plan to use them, not yet. But I knew the market would. As I sat at home that night, surrounded by silence and the dull hum of my computer, I realized something strange. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was patient. Because when arrogance meets incompetence in the boardroom, all you have to do is wait. And I had all the time in the world. 2 days after I was fired, the company sent a courier to collect my access badge and laptop. I handed them over without hesitation. But I kept the real weapon, the encrypted drive that contained every inconsistency Lena Vale had ever signed her name to. By that time, the entire building was buzzing about my departure. I knew how the story would be told. She'd say I'd been underperforming, that I'd lost focus near the end. And people would believe her, because fear makes loyalty easy to buy. I spent the next 48 hours doing what no one at Rutherford and Vale ever thought I would. Nothing. I didn't reach out to old colleagues, didn't call the CEO, didn't post any cryptic messages online. Silence became my signal. And in the world of corporate politics, silence makes people nervous. That Friday, the merger announcement went public. The headlines called it a defining moment for mid-market finance. Photos showed Lena smiling beside the CEO and Hallberg's founder, her hand resting casually on the documents I had once prepared. She looked radiant, powerful, untouchable. But I could see the cracks even in the photos, the forced smiles, the missing details in the press release, the numbers that didn't align. The documents she had signed weren't just flawed. They were fraudulent. Hallberg Dynamics wasn't worth $285 million. I knew that because I had audited their books myself. At best, the company's value was closer to $170 million. The rest was wishful accounting, a fantasy built on Lena's desperation to prove herself. I hadn't planned to intervene. But as I watched her take credit for my work, something inside me shifted. I remembered the humiliation in her voice when she fired me, the satisfaction in her eyes. She didn't just want power. She wanted to erase me. That's when I decided to let the truth speak for itself. I logged into a private network that no one at Rutherford and Vale even knew existed, a sandbox system I had built for confidential audits. It wasn't illegal, just invisible. Within minutes, I uploaded a bundle of documents, the falsified valuation reports, internal memos, time-stamped edits, and the final proposal draft showing my name removed and hers inserted. I didn't send it to the press. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I sent it anonymously to the Federal Financial Oversight Committee, a group known for investigating irregularities in corporate mergers. And for good measure, I copied a few of the firm's top investors. Then I waited. The first tremor hit within 24 hours. Someone from Hallberg's accounting department noticed a discrepancy in the final disclosure figures. By the time Lena tried to smooth it over, the Oversight Committee had already opened an inquiry. Emails started flying inside the firm. Meetings were canceled, PR statements were drafted and redrafted. The board was demanding answers. And Lena, for the first time in her career, had none. From my apartment, I watched it all unfold quietly. The firm's stock began to wobble. Investors grew restless, and by Monday morning, exactly 4 days after I'd been fired, the $285 million merger was on the brink of collapse. Lena still didn't know it was me. She thought her enemies were inside the company, clawing for power. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because revenge, I've learned, isn't about striking back. It's about making sure your absence hurts more than your presence ever did. And for Lena Vale, my silence had just become the loudest sound in the room. By Monday morning, the whispers had turned into open panic. What was supposed to be the proudest day in Rutherford and Vale's history had turned into a silent implosion. The Oversight Committee had issued a temporary suspension of merger proceedings, pending data verification. In the corporate world, that phrase was poison. The firm's valuation plummeted overnight. Clients began calling in, asking if their investments were at risk. The board convened an emergency meeting, and within hours, Lena's confidence began to crack. I still had friends in the company, people who owed me favors, people who had seen what I'd built before she dismantled it. They began feeding me updates through encrypted messages. "Lena's losing it," one text read. "She's blaming the analysts, the accountants, everyone." "Her father's furious," another said. "She's saying you left incomplete data, that this is your fault." Of course she was. Blame was her native language. What I hadn't expected, though, was how fast she'd turn on her own team. She threw her project manager under the bus in front of the board, accusing him of negligence. She even implied that Halberg's CFO had doctored numbers to manipulate the valuation. But lies can only stretch so far before they snap. And when they snapped, they turned inward. That evening, I got a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Richard Vale, the CEO himself. My phone lit up with his name, and for a long moment I just stared at it. Then I answered, "Is it true?" His voice was low, measured, but the anger underneath was unmistakable. "Did you know about these inconsistencies?" "I did," I said evenly. "I also tried to fix them. Before I was fired," silence. "The kind that weighs more than words." "You're saying Lena signed off on this?" "I'm saying," I replied, "you gave her a position she wasn't ready for, and now the company is paying for it." He didn't respond. The line stayed open for a few seconds longer, then ended with a quiet click. That was when it hit me. He hadn't called to understand. He'd called to confirm what he already feared. By Tuesday morning, the story had leaked to the financial press. The headline on one site read, "Rutherford and Vale faces inquiry over inflated valuations in 285 Nenner's deal." I didn't need to write the story. The numbers did that for me. Inside the firm, chaos reigned. Lena's friends began distancing themselves, whispering to the board about her lack of oversight. Her father stopped returning her calls. The merger was frozen indefinitely, and the investors who once praised her brilliance now demanded her resignation. But the cruelest betrayal wasn't from them. It came from within her own family. Late that night, one of my old colleagues messaged me. "Richard just told Lena she's suspended pending investigation. She's furious. She's saying someone set her up." In a way, she was right. But what she never understood was that I hadn't needed to frame her. She'd done that herself. All I did was make sure the truth saw daylight. I stared at my screen for a long time after that message, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. I had exposed her. I had proven my worth. But part of me still remembered that first day, the bright-eyed intern I once was, believing that merit could protect you from privilege. Now I knew better. In the world of power and money, betrayal isn't a moment. It's a culture. And Lena Vale was just its latest disciple. What she didn't realize was that her downfall had only begun. Because when an empire starts to crumble, it's not the collapse that destroys you. It's the silence that follows. I didn't want revenge to feel theatrical. I wanted it to feel inevitable, like a weather front that arrives because the air finally reached the point where it had to move. So I built a plan that didn't rely on dramatic confrontations or grand speeches. I built a plan that relied on systems, trust, timing, and the very things the firm prized most: numbers and reputation. First, credibility. If I wanted anyone outside the firm to listen, I couldn't look like a scorned ex-employee with an axe to grind. I needed legal cover and a clean trail. I called an old lawyer friend I'd helped years ago with a complicated acquisition. I explained everything without theatrics. The doctored projections, the signed memos, Lena's edits. He listened, asked for copies, and told me to sit tight while he prepared a whistleblower package that complied with regulatory protections. That call turned my anger into armor. Next, alliances. People inside the firm were frightened, but fear makes people sloppy, also vulnerable to truth. I quietly reached out to 2 former colleagues who still felt loyal to the work rather than to Lena's ambition. One still had access to archaic audit logs that management assumed were obsolete. The other kept a private inbox with months of unredacted conversations. They didn't want publicity. They wanted the company to survive without the rot. I promised them anonymity and safeguards. They promised me facts, then came leverage. In the finance world, the strongest form of leverage is uncertainty. You don't need to prove every allegation right away. You need to create a chain reaction that forces powerful people to act before they can cover the trail. I arranged the timing carefully. Regulatory inquiries move slowly when there's no immediate pressure. But investors, fund managers, trustees, family offices move fast when their returns are at risk. So I seated the right people with the right questions. I began by preparing a dossier that read like a forensic audit. Timestamps, redlined drafts, a reconciliation showing how Halberg's revenue had been inflated, and the exact edits Lena had made. I made 2 copies, one for the oversight committee with my lawyer's cover letter, and one for selected investors who were known to be conservative and intolerant of opacity. Both packages were clean, professional, and devastating in their simplicity. But I didn't send everything at once. Patience was my strategy. I released the first tranche to the investors, enough to raise alarm, but not enough to be dismissed as rumor. The reaction was immediate. Several institutional investors demanded emergency calls, board members received sharp letters, and 3 analysts published cautious notes questioning the valuation. Market nervousness grew. That nervousness was the oxygen my next move needed. My next move hit the boardroom. I used the investors' letters and the oversight committee's acknowledgement to demand an emergency shareholder meeting. I didn't attend. Presence would have made my role obvious, but I watched the fallout. The board was forced to act publicly. They commissioned an independent audit, froze certain transactions, and temporarily removed Lena from merger oversight. Her allies scrambled to defend her, but the audit process is brutal in its neutrality. It doesn't care about family names. It cares about ledgers, signatures, and paper trails. I also made sure no one could easily pin the collapse on me. Every time rumors tried to frame me as the saboteur, I let the documents speak louder. My lawyer ensured the committee had everything they needed to subpoena records. The independent auditor began to request emails and server logs that only internal admins could provide. That was when the firm's IT team, the quiet middle of every corporate engine, began to cough up the evidence I'd quietly archived months earlier. The emotional part of the plan was simple but vital. I never sent a message that read like revenge. I framed everything as stewardship, protecting investors, protecting clients, protecting the firm's integrity. That framing made it hard for Richard to brand me a vengeful ex-employee without looking like a father defending his daughter against facts. And protecting the firm's integrity forced board members to choose between loyalty to family and fiduciary responsibility. I also prepared for contingencies. If the auditors went slow, I had a second tranche ready for a senior investigative reporter I trusted, one who understood the nuance of M&A fraud and wouldn't sensationalize names. If the firm tried to bury documents, my lawyer had secured copies filed with a regulator's secure portal, effectively a dead man's switch that would surface if my account was deactivated. All through this, I kept my life outwardly ordinary. Grocery trips, a new coffee mug, a few late-night work sessions that looked like harmless resume building. The mundane was my camouflage. People assumed the drama belonged to boardrooms and press releases, not to the quiet woman who once optimized cash flow models in a fluorescent-lit cubicle. By the time the audit's preliminary report landed on the boardroom table, the narrative had already shifted from internal mishap to systemic oversight failure. Lena's defense, that she had been misled by subordinates, crumbled under the weight of signatures and edits bearing her initials. The family name that once insulated poor decisions now magnified them. I never wanted to watch someone burn. I wanted the facts to do the work, and when the facts finally met the light, they did what facts always do. They forced choices. Choices that would reveal who had built this firm on merit, and who had tried to buy their way into power. The day of the shareholder meeting arrived like the final note in a long, drawn-out symphony. Every major investor, partner, and board member filled the glass-walled conference room at Rutherford and Vale's headquarters. The skyline outside glittered as if nothing was wrong, but inside the tension could slice through steel. I wasn't there, of course. I didn't need to be. The truth was already sitting in the center of that table, bound in a blue folder marked Confidential, Audit Findings. The independent auditors, hired under pressure from investors, had completed their report 2 days earlier. Every page was a quiet act of justice. It traced Lena's edits, her inflated projections, her falsified signatures, and the way she had quietly reallocated valuation margins to make Halberg Dynamics look like a gold mine instead of the crumbling liability it really was. The board had no choice but to confront it. I heard from a source inside that Lena walked in that morning with her father behind her, chin high, eyes hollow. For the first time, she didn't wear her usual power color red. She wore black. A coincidence, maybe. Or maybe somewhere deep down, she already knew this was the funeral of her own authority. When the auditors finished presenting, the room fell silent. The chairman, an older man who'd once told me, "Numbers don't lie, people do," cleared his throat and asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Who signed off on these? The answer, of course, was Lena. Her initials appeared on every altered document, every inflated figure, every minor adjustment. Her father tried to speak, tried to shield her, but the shareholders cut him off. One of them, a woman who'd been with the firm since its founding, stood and said, "This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate deception." That's when it happened. The official vote of no confidence. Within minutes, Lena was suspended indefinitely from all executive duties. The CEO, her father, was placed on temporary leave pending review. The firm's communications team scrambled to draft a press release that wouldn't tank their remaining value. But the truth doesn't wait for PR approval. Within hours, the news spread across every major financial outlet. Rutherford and Vail merger collapses amid fraud probe. Executives stepped down. The headlines didn't name me. They didn't need to. My fingerprints were everywhere but invisible, like the architect of a building who'd already left long before the walls came down. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, the same one where I'd been fired days earlier. On my laptop screen, news anchors discussed possible internal corruption and structural oversight failures. My phone buzzed endlessly, some with messages of disbelief, some with quiet congratulations from people who had once looked at me like I was expendable. Then came the final act. That evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was calm, precise. "This is the Oversight Committee," they said. "We'd like to thank you for your cooperation and integrity in providing information during this inquiry. Without your documentation, the extent of this manipulation may not have been uncovered." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Integrity. That word hit harder than any applause or revenge fantasy ever could. The next day, the firm's stock nosedived nearly 20%. Investors began pulling funds, clients suspended contracts, and the Halberg merger was declared void. In financial terms, Rutherford and Vail had lost over $285 million in valuation. In human terms, it was the cost of arrogance, and one woman's need to feel untouchable. As for Lena, she disappeared from the public eye. Rumor had it she fled to Europe under the guise of sabbatical. Her father eventually stepped down quietly, citing personal reasons. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. The revenge was complete. Not because they lost everything, but because they finally understood the weight of what they had taken from me. They had tried to erase my name from their history. Instead, I'd erased their history from the market. And in that quiet apartment, as the rain tapped against the window, I realized something. Justice doesn't always arrive in the form of punishment. Sometimes it arrives as silence, the kind that follows when the truth finally speaks. A week after the collapse, the city seemed to hum with the story. I'd hear my old firm's name whispered in cafes, see snippets of analysis flash across business news tickers, each version slightly distorted, yet all circling the same truth. Rutherford and Vail had fallen under its own weight. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to panic or pressure. No morning briefings, no deadlines, just quiet. I didn't realize how much I'd forgotten the sound of peace until it returned. I spent the days sorting through old documents, deleting the remnants of a life I'd already outgrown. The more I deleted, the lighter I felt, Revenge had filled the empty spaces that humiliation once occupied. But it wasn't the end I wanted to stay in. It was a bridge, a necessary one, to something freer. Then one afternoon my phone buzzed with an email. The sender's name made my stomach tighten. Richard Vale. The message was short. I know what you did. And though I can't say it publicly, thank you. You saved the firm from something far worse. I only wish I had seen it sooner. No apology. No excuses. Just acknowledgement. And in that one quiet line, I heard the closest thing to closure I would ever get. I didn't reply. Some stories deserve to end in silence. In the following months, I accepted a position at a smaller investment firm, a place that valued precision over pedigree. I didn't tell them the whole story, only that I'd been through something that taught me the cost of integrity. They didn't press. They just nodded. Sometimes I'd pass the old building on my way to client meetings. The logo had changed. The lights in the top floor offices, the ones where Lena used to hold her performative strategy sessions, were dark now. The empire she tried to inherit had become a warning whispered through the industry. Don't fake numbers, and don't underestimate the quiet ones. That became my unspoken legacy. Not revenge, not exposure, clarity. I learned that power built on deceit is like glass under pressure. It looks solid until the first crack appears. And I learned that you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, all you have to do is document the truth and let it speak when the world is ready. I walked away with my name intact, my conscience clean, and something more valuable than any bonus. Peace. When the dust settled, I didn't feel the thrill I'd expected. There was no champagne moment, no grand speech of triumph. Just silence, and a strange kind of peace. I'd watched them crumble. But what I truly destroyed wasn't a company. It was the illusion of untouchable power. The CEO's daughter, once smug in her privilege, disappeared from every professional circle. Her LinkedIn turned blank. Her name faded from headlines. The father, once the architect of dominance, retired due to stress. But me? I built something new. Quiet. Focused. A firm that rewarded competence, not bloodline. It took months before I stopped replaying that final meeting in my head, not the chaos, but the moment I looked at the board, knowing I'd earned that calm. They had fired me out of spite, and I responded not with anger, but with precision. And that's what I learned. Revenge doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it's a slow exhale, a whisper that says you shouldn't have underestimated me. This was never about destroying them. It was about reclaiming myself, my dignity, my worth, my voice. Because when you strip away the politics, the titles, and the corporate noise, all that remains is truth. And truth, once revealed, doesn't need to shout. This is revenge untold, where power meets its reckoning, and silence becomes the sharpest weapon. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories where every downfall begins with a whisper.